Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about a couple of key factors that our company considers when we're building stabilizers and how those are going to help all of you choose the right stabilizer for you based on your specific needs. We're going to talk about how to set those stabilizers up properly with choosing the right mass weight and how to balance the bow to aim well, as well as tuning for the shot reaction. And we're also going to share a little bit about how our team is setting up their stabilizers, our sponsored athletes, what lengths they're using, and how much mass weight they're using as well. This is going to be taught from a little bit of a recurve perspective, but almost everything applies to recurve and compound, so don't worry. Okay, a little bit about me. I have about 10 years of shooting experience. I don't shoot as much anymore because I'm busy building stabilizers all the time. But I was on the junior national team in the United States for 3 years. I trained at our Olympic Training Center for 5, and I have a lot of experience with both coaching and building stabilizers over the last 8 years. Before we jump into my presentation, I want to know just a little bit about you guys. Who is compound? Okay, we've got a good amount of compounders. How about recurve? Anybody barebow? Okay, get out. No, I'm just kidding, you can stay. Okay, so starting out with our company, the way we got started and what we're doing with stabilizers is when we were training, we shot on a very windy field. Every single day at about 10 in the morning, the wind would start to get pretty intense. And that was frustrating for us as shooters because we always felt like we're working very hard to make a certain type of shot and get better with our technique and perform our best. And whether it's at training or competition, the wind was a bit of a frustrating factor. And at the time, we felt like there was an opportunity to make equipment that served our needs a little bit better as athletes. So because a lot of the stabilizers at the time were very stiff, which was good and helpful, gave us options for what weight we wanted to use, the wind efficiency was not very good. A lot of the stuff was kind of fat and thick and kind of turned into a sail when it would start to get windy. So we felt like that could be improved, and we wanted to start to make the products that we felt should exist to help archers shoot their best, but they just weren't on the market yet. And I'm going to share 2 theories of stabilization with you guys today. The first one is that a thin stabilizer is going to be less affected by the wind, and that if you can shrink down that diameter and make your stabilizers more wind efficient, you'll have a little bit of an advantage when you're competing in bad conditions. So the way that we went about so before we move on, what is wind efficiency? For stabilizers, wind efficiency is just measuring how much is the wind going to affect pushing you while you're aiming. The more windy it gets, the more your equipment's going to be pushed by the wind, and that's going to make it more difficult to aim on target and execute your shot the way that you want to. There's really only one way we can make a product more wind efficient, and that's by shrinking down the outer diameter of the stabilizer. That gets to be pretty expensive, but it is very, very valuable. From 2013 to 2016, we tried a lot of different ways to improve this. We started buying like random cheap carbon from different places online and cobbling together prototypes. And at first we were just building them for ourselves. Then we started to make them for some of our friends. And then before long, people we didn't even know were wanting to buy them. And we started working with different carbon manufacturers to customize the tube and make it better. And we actually started to see some early success at the national and international level when we were shrinking down the diameter. And one of our first big successes was Steve Weiler, who a lot of you guys may have heard before, won his first World Cup shooting with one of our early models of a thin stabilizer. And what we felt that showed for us was starting to prove the theory that if we shrink down the diameter and we make the stabilizer more wind efficient, we're going to see better results in competition. So how that plays into choosing a stabilizer for yourself is that we want to make sure that you're getting the most wind efficient stabilizer that is going to fit within your budget, and also that is going to support the amount of mass weight that you use. So unfortunately, the more thin we make the stabilizers, typically the weaker they're going to get. So we want to make sure that we're still using a product that's stiff enough to support the amount of mass weight on your bow, but as thin as possible to still improve your performance when you're shooting outdoors. So now we come to stiffness, and this one gets a little bit more complicated. So when we started making the stabilizers thinner, we ran into an issue where it was working well for a lot of the recurve archers, but a lot of the compound archers were finding that even though maybe it held okay in the wind, it wasn't really feeling great and helping them perform their best. So this led us to start to believe the theory of stabilization number 2, which is that it's not only making the product feel good or be skinny that was important, but we have to match the right stiffness to each archer and their bow, their needs, the amount of mass weight that they're using. And so, stabilizer stiffness is, it's a buzzword we all hear thrown around. Every single stabilizer company has the stiffest thing, and there's a lot of marketing hyperbole around how stiff a product is, but we wanted to actually start to measure and test, can we, from a little bit more of a scientific perspective, match each archer's bow and mass weight needs to a stabilizer that's appropriately stiff for them. So the stiffness of the stabilizer is going to determine how much mass weight it can support before it starts to get floppy. That's going to have effects in how well you're aiming on target. And the only way we can make the stabilizers stiffer is we either have to make them fatter, which is not good, or we have to use very, very expensive materials, which is also not good for everybody's wallet. So when we're measuring the stiffness, there's a couple different ways you can measure it. We started out using the 3-point bend test, which is kind of similar to how we measure an arrow spine. We were measuring it that way because there wasn't really any industry standard to describe what is really the stiffness of a stabilizer. And rather than just telling people our stuff was stiff or telling them it was the best, we wanted to kind of have some data and measurements behind it that could let us give a real comparison from one stabilizer to another so that athletes could start to really understand which stabilizer is going to work well with their equipment. Over time though, because we wanted to make something that was a little bit more applicable directly to how a stabilizer works rather than an arrow, we changed to doing a cantilever bend test, which is what we call a C-spine. Like my image right here shows, we're locking down one end of the stabilizer, and at 30 inches, we're putting 5 pounds on the end. We're measuring the deflection, and that's giving more of a real-world example of how stiff the product is when it's on the athlete's bow. And when we do that, we can start to make more clear recommendations about which stabilizer is going to fit you. However, even though we're talking about stiffness being helpful and important, you need to remember that just like an arrow, we're not just trying to have the stiffest arrow you can possibly shoot. We're trying to find out which arrow is actually going to tune with your bow. And just like your draw weight is the most important factor in selecting which arrow spine is going to work well for you, the mass weight that you put on the end of your long rod is going to determine which stabilizer is going to shoot best for you. So I have a chart here that has all of our products. We have the stiffness of the product with the C-spine, and then we also have like an ideal and more like a maximum weight capacity. The maximum weight is not saying the product's going to break, but it's just saying it's probably going to start to feel a little bit floppy. So whether you're shooting a RamRods product or a product from any other company, you could measure the stiffness, just like I described, lock one end down, and then hang 5 pounds from the other side. You can measure how much it's moving, and then you could slide in that measurement in a chart like this one and kind of see where that fits in how much weight it can support. So our XP is our weakest stabilizer. That one is not going to work very well if you put a ton of weight on it. We're going to do some questions at the end. We're on limited time, so I just want to get through everything. And then we go all the way up to the Beast, which is pretty much only for compound shooters who are crazy and put a ton of weight on their bow. So if anybody wants to take a picture of that chart and you want to reference it later and measure your own stabilizer, you could compare it to here and see approximately how much weight that would be able to support. Okay, so as we started to make a variety of products that were matching different stiffnesses for different amounts of weight, we were able to serve the needs of a lot more athletes. We started to see compound, recurve, men, women, short, tall, and everybody in between now had a product that would match them properly. So how this kind of factors into your own selection for which stabilizer you're going to use for yourself is we just want to make sure that you're getting a stabilizer that's stiff enough to support that amount of weight. I see a lot of archers who are using very little weight on a very, very stiff stabilizer. That's not really super helpful because then you're going to run into an issue that maybe the stabilizer feels harsh or it's vibrating a lot, and even if you tune your bow well, things aren't going to sound very good. On the other side, maybe we have a lot of mass weight on a very, very weak stabilizer and it's starting to get floppy. It's definitely not as bad to put a tiny amount of weight on a stiff stabilizer. It's still going to aim and perform well, just might not feel the best. But when we start to put a lot of mass weight on a weak stabilizer, we can start to get issues with more rapid sight pin movement, start to get some floppiness while you're aiming because that stabilizer is not able to fully support that amount of weight. Now we're going to talk about selecting the lengths. Now this is actually the hardest question we get asked as a company is when people need help knowing what length to use and how much weight to use. That's complicated because everybody's very different. We have to factor in your height and your draw length. We have to factor in your shooting style and preferences. And it gets pretty tough to actually just tell everybody exactly which length is right for them. But what I do have here is I have two different charts. This is the simple one, and the next one gets a little bit more complicated. And the goal of these charts is to give a good starting point for people, to give you a range of where you should probably be. So in this chart, you're going to find out where you fit in height, and I do apologize that this is all in inches. So you can Google converting inches to centimeters, and you can do a conversion that way and put yourself in this chart. But for myself, I'm between 5'7" and 6'1". I know I look much taller than that. So that means that my total system length should be between 28 to 34 inches, which is a big range, but there's a lot of room for individual needs in this chart. So when we're talking about total system length, that means my extension, if I'm using one, my V-bar mount, eye-bolt or QDC, and my long stabilizer. We're not counting the damper and weights because that's getting a little bit too complicated, but just the total system should be probably in this range. And we, in our testing with athletes, about 95% of people that we tested fit within these ranges. So it's not going to tell you necessarily exactly what weight is perfect or which lengths are perfect, but it's going to give you a good idea. So if I'm going to shoot between this 28 to 34 inch system length, one way that I might set that up would be a 28-inch long rod, 3-inch extension, and maybe I go with some 13.5-inch side rods. And now we're going to go to the slightly more complicated one. So this one's a bit more of a work in progress, but what we're trying to put together is a formula that can give you a little bit more of a tight range of exactly which length is going to work best for you. So the way that we do this is we take your height in inches. You can use the same calculation with centimeters as well. And then you're going to multiply your height by 0.45. So in this case, if I take 72 inches, I multiply it by 0.45. That's giving me 32.5 is kind of my starting point for how long my total system length should be. With our team, 80% of the athletes fit within 2 inches above or below this number. Then, like I mentioned earlier, though, we have to account for the individual's desired shot reaction. How do they want the bow to jump or spin? So when we're talking about jumping in this chart, that is, how much is the bow going to want to leave your hand and then spin after the shot? So some people might want it to be a very calm, slow shot reaction. They don't want the bow to have too much personality. Maybe that's more like the American style setup with the really long side rods and the 30-inch no extension, and we just want it to hold and aim and then just kind of slowly drop forward. So if I'm going to do something like that, I'm going to go with the 30 and the 15s. My extension V-bar QDC might add an inch or two, and that'll get me around that length. If I'm on the other side and I want a very jumpy, aggressive bow and I want it to feel like it's flying towards the target, then I'm going to put a longer extension on there and I'm going to shorten up the long rod and go with some shorter side rods, and that is going to give me a much more, a bow with a lot more personality. It's going to want to jump, it's going to want to spin, and it's going to probably encourage more of like an aggressive, quick shot process. So to do this for yourself, take your height, multiply by 0.45, and that's a good starting point for most people. Now, this formula is skewed just a little bit towards the shorter side because we see more athletes shooting things that are too long for them, especially when they're a little bit less experienced. And so we want to try to tame the length a little bit because a lot of people are using something a bit too long. For our team members, we have a very large team of sponsored athletes around the world. For recurve shooters, the average length of just the long rod, we're not talking about the whole system, but the average long rod length is 29.4. So when we made this chart, we did not sell a 29-inch stabilizer, so after seeing this, we are releasing some 29-inch ones so that we're right on the peak of the bell curve of what everybody's using. And for compound shooters, we saw that like over 90% of all the stabilizers we sell to compound shooters are 30-inch. So if you're a compound shooter and you don't know what length to use, just shoot a 30 and you'll be totally fine. Okay, then after we've chosen which stabilizer we're going to shoot, because we know the wind efficiency and stiffness that we need, and then we've chosen the lengths that we're going to use, now we have to figure out what is the right amount of mass weight to put on each of those stabilizers. So even if you're going to use potentially a lot of weight, I always recommend that when you're setting up a bow fresh that we start with a small amount of mass weight, even if you know you're going to go way above that. And I would go and shoot at a target and just start very light and gradually start to work your way up. And I would recommend shooting at least 2 ends with just 1 to 3 ounces, then add an ounce or 2 on, go ahead and shoot again, see how it feels, and very slowly start to add that mass weight. We see a lot of times that when people are setting up their bow, they like to load up a lot of weight right away. But it's very easy to let that weight start to become a crutch and rely on the bow just being heavy to make things still, rather than accomplishing that through improvement of your technique and your posture and just building up strength to control the bow with your body, rather than just relying on the equipment to do that for you. And I recommend as you're increasing the weight and you start to get a little bit higher, maybe you're shooting 8, 10, 20 ounces. Some of you crazy compound people like to put like 25 or 30 on there. Make sure that it's a weight you can control for an entire day when you're starting to add weight and you're experimenting, because I see a lot of times athletes will go shoot 1 round, they put on a bunch of weight, they go shoot 1 round, everything's good, and then they go to a competition where they have to shoot more arrows, they're standing longer, and then they start to get tired and realize that mass weight is actually starting to now work against them and is making their job more difficult. So make sure we can use that weight for a whole day, and I recommend you should be able to shoot double the amount of arrows that you're going to do in competition, in training, without starting to feel fatigued and like your bow is getting out of control. For our team, these are the weights that everybody is using on average, and this is just for the long stabilizer. So as you can imagine, as we go from the development level all the way up to the pro level, we're seeing the weights are increasing a little bit. That doesn't mean that if you want to shoot like a pro, you have to go shoot 10 ounces right away. That just means that we're seeing as athletes are getting better, they have more training and experience, they're able to handle more weight and still compete at a high level. Okay, now we've chosen the stabilizer, we have chosen the amount of mass weight that we're going to use. Now it's time to tune the stabilizers to actually start to perform better and assist you more in your shooting. So my favorite system for how to tune and make my stabilizers hold my pin as still as possible is I like to do this at 18 meters. I go on the back side of a target and I fold it in quarters so that I make a cross like this. And then you can use some black tape or any colored tape or even a Sharpie and trace out that line so you have a nice clean X in the middle of your target. And then the way that we tune the stabilizers is you're going to go to full draw and you're going to set your sight pin in the center of this cross. And then what I want you to do is pay attention to what is the first movement that your sight pin wants to do. And I would say maybe repeat this 2, 3, 4 times until you can start to see there's a little bit of a pattern. Maybe your sight pin starts in the very center and then it wants to drift down to the right. Or maybe it hits in the center and then kind of wants to lift up and back down and up and back down. We want to just use this cross to find the pattern first. Once we have the pattern, we have a lot of options of what we do with that. So don't worry, I'm not going to read all of these out, but I'm going to give a couple examples. Let's say that your sight pin is dropping low. So you put it in the middle and it wants to drop down. We have a lot of tools at our disposal with a stabilizer system to remedy this. So in this chart I have my in order of operations, which things we should do first. So if my sight is dropping low, then the primary goal that I need to accomplish is to move the center of gravity back a little bit, or I might need to reduce my total mass weight. So if I want to move the center of gravity back towards me a little bit, I could remove 1 ounce from my long stabilizer. I could add an ounce to each of my side rods, or if I'm shooting compound, just to one side. Or if I'm using a V-bar or back bar that's adjustable, I can start to bring that side rod back towards me, closer to the bow. And all these different options are going to move the center of gravity back towards me and make it less likely that my sight pin is going to want to drop out of the middle. Now, this doesn't account for if we have target panic, and that's why we can't aim in the middle. You're going to have to solve that one a different way. Another common thing we might see is that the sight pin is drifting left or right. I hold in the center and then it kind of wants to go to one side. If this is happening, my sight is drifting to the right, then I want to move my center of gravity to the left. So I could add a little bit of weight to that left side rod. I could remove some weight from the right side if I'm using 2 side rods. Or I can basically move one of my side rods with an adjustable V-bar away from the direction that my sight is drifting. That's going to shift the center of gravity a little bit and make it less likely that my pin is going to drift. We can also use the same idea with a compound when we're trying to get the bubble to sit very naturally without having to fight to line that bubble up. Just move your side rod away from whichever direction your bubble is going. No, other way. You can, so if my bubble is going to the right, I'm going to move my side rod a little bit to the right. And we use that side rod to correct so that I can just draw back and my bubble wants to sit level and I don't have to fight my bow to get everything lined up. Because the goal of the stabilizers is to make aiming as easy and natural as possible. We want to try to make this a very subconscious, easy part of your shot. And if you have a combination of maybe down and to the right, and your sight keeps moving that way, always solve for the up and down movement first, and then take care of your left and right. Don't change too many variables at one time. Okay, now these are a lot of different ways we can control the shot reaction. So like I was mentioning earlier, the shot reaction is kind of describing what does the bow do after the shot. Now I know that when the bow is jumping and it's after the shot, the arrow's already gone, and it maybe doesn't feel like it's affecting where the arrow goes a lot, but there is a strong connection psychologically between what we know our bow is about to do and how we're actually executing our shot process. So there's a lot of benefit to finding the right bow reaction so that all the way through the end of follow-through, your process is feeling connected and you feel comfortable with how your bow is aiming, shooting, and reacting after the shot, and that helps to tie the whole shot process together from the start to the finish. So when we want the bow to be more aggressive, I want it to jump more or I want it to spin more. This is all about moving the center of gravity forward. There's a lot of ways to do that. We can make the system longer. We can add mass weight to the front rod or remove it from the side rods. Or we can basically move the V-bars out to move the center of gravity forward. If anyone wants to take a picture of that to be able to experiment later, these are all the tools at your disposal. If we want to make things less aggressive, you feel like maybe the shot's out of control, we're going to do just the opposite and move the center of gravity backwards a little bit. Okay, now I I have a list here of the order of operations for choosing and setting up the stabilizers. We always obviously have to pick the product first, then we have to make sure that we have the right lengths, we have to find our mass weight, and then we're tuning for the holding and shot reaction. But one very important factor here that I also see people skip over is anytime you make an adjustment to your stabilizers, you're adding weight, you're changing the length, you got to retune the bow afterwards. Stabilizers have a very significant impact on the tune of the bow, and you might retune the bow to hold better and feel better, but if we don't retune the with either bare shaft tuning or paper tuning afterwards, you might actually not notice an improvement in your results because we've taken the bow out of tune by making those changes. Okay, I tried to go quickly so we could have some time for questions. The rest of our time will be any questions that people have about our company, stabilizers, tuning, any problems you have with your setup. We can go into some of those now. Yes?
I wanted to ask why you take the height of the people as a measure for the size of the rod?
Because people are better at measuring their height consistently than their draw length. Good question.
Yeah.
Yes, in the back.
Can you take just a quick release mount make much difference?
In terms of performance, you're not going to notice much of a difference. I will say that you actually lose a little bit of stiffness shooting a quick disconnect mount rather than an eye bolt or mounting the stabilizer directly into the bow. But it's a small enough difference that most people aren't going to feel it, and they just like the convenience. Because we all know archers can be a little lazy sometimes. Yes?
Do you have a rough guideline for the ratio between front and back?
Good question. Recurve or compound? Recurve. So I would generally recommend, let's say we're starting from the very beginning of finding the mass weight for your setup. Maybe we would put 3 ounces on the front and like 4 on each of the side rods. It kind of depends on your preference too and what kind of shot reaction you're looking for. If you're looking for a little bit more of a slower controlled shot process, you take a little more time, you like to aim a little bit longer, and you want the bow to be a little bit more calm, you might end up with an ounce or 2 extra on the side rods versus the long rod. If you're on the other side of that and you want a very kind of quick, aggressive shot reaction, we're not spending too much time aiming, you're just kind of looking and going, and you want to keep things very aggressive, then you might go the opposite. Maybe you would go like 2 on the side rods and 4 on the long rod for your starting amount. So just kind of think about what kind of bow reaction you want, and I would skew it a little bit forward or backward based on if you want a slower reaction or a more aggressive reaction, because that's really what's going to determine that ratio. But we see it all over the place. I've seen it like 8 and 3, and I've seen it like 10 and 4. It really just depends on you.
And how about compound as well?
For compound, we almost always see a little bit more weight on the back bar than the front. So I would recommend maybe start with like, start at 2 to 1, maybe 6 on the back, 3 on the front could be like a starting point. But again, it's just going to, it also depends on the bow too, because based on where you're mounting that back bar, whether you're putting it up front by the long rod or are you putting it down on the back of the bow, like that seems to be a big trend right now. I would say maybe start with 2 to 1 and kind of go from there. And you'll feel pretty quickly when you're doing when you have that cross set up and you just kind of set that sight pin in the middle and see what it wants to do, you're going to get information pretty quickly on how we need to shift that ratio between the front and the back. Let's go here.
Okay. About the mass weight.
Yes.
You said when you try to discover your mass weight,
Mhm.
1 to 3 ounce,
Mhm.
is it with the damper or without the damper?
I would just like put the damper on, but don't really count it as part of the mass weight, because you know the damper is going to be there no matter what, so just don't worry about adding that in.
Okay. I shoot mostly 3D, so I have a little bit. I shoot the rates.
Okay.
And I like to be dead in the head, no movement whatsoever. I shoot, it stays. No.
Okay.
Because I missed those in
slides, the rates.
Mhm.
Can I improve with the length of the bar, or should I
So
focus on weights?
if you want the bow reaction to just be like dead, you don't want it to go anywhere. You just want to shoot and the bow just stays, right? So is it kind of jumping forward right now a little bit?
Tiny bit.
Tiny bit. So I would say when that would be making the bow less aggressive is what you want to do. So we could remove some mass weight from your front bar, or we could add a little bit of weight to a back bar. Are you using the back bar
Yeah,
right now?
I have about, I think, 4 on the front and 8 in the back.
Okay, you can add more to the back. That's totally fine. You're not going to hurt anything. Yeah, if you want to keep the total mass weight the same, you could go like 1 from the front and put it on the back. Or you could just add to the back if you're okay with the mass weight going up a little bit. And that should start to slow down its reaction. If that's not enough, you might need to shorten the front rod a little bit or make the back bar a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And that will help to calm it down and make it very still for you.
Okay, thanks.
Can you go back to about one of the first slides where you showed the weight?
C curve, the bending.
Oh yeah, the spine? Yeah, let's go back. This one.
Yes, that one. Thank you.
Mhm.
Will the slides be available on your website afterwards?
I
The charts mainly.
I don't have it on the website already, but we're working on putting together a lot more charts and graphs that will make this easy to measure. I will use that as a reminder to make sure I get that done quickly.
Yeah, because the pictures we've got won't be as good as what we could download.
Yeah, sure, I understand.
At what length did you measure?
So when we do the cantilever bend test to get the C spine, we measure a 30-inch stabilizer, and we're hanging 5 pounds on the end. And then we have you ever seen the tool that they use to measure the arrow spine? We hang we set that up on the tip, and then we just measure how much it's dropping down.
Can I have another question? It's more about your specific stabilizer, like you have the normal vector and the vector with the tungsten.
Mhm.
What's the difference between that? Is it just in feel, or?
Yeah, so the tungsten damping on the inside is going to do 2 things that are helpful. The first one is you're getting weight on the front of your stabilizer that is not exposed to the wind. So that is in our effort to try to shrink down the cross section as much as we possibly can. And then also you have a very nice damping effect from the tungsten. So the tungsten damping has powdered tungsten inside of the stabilizer, and all of those little particles are directly in contact with the carbon. So you're getting a really significant vibration reduction from adding that in, and it feels very different from just putting a rubber damper on the end. It feels really nice.
Okay, but on the other hand, also one thing is that you want to connect a lot of mass directly to your bow in the moment of release. And in that case, if you have the powder, you have the mass, but you lose the direct coupling.
Well, if you want to do vibration reduction, you have to have something decoupled. You can't do vibration reduction with everything completely locked down. So that if you only care about just pure stability and nothing else, then the tungsten damping or a damper in general is not really going to help that. But most people find that that tiny bit of decoupling that you're getting is worth it to get everything to feel and sound a lot better. But this is one of those things that also falls into personal preference. Everybody's going to have a different opinion on what they really prioritize and what they really like. One here?
Yeah, down-angled long rods. Is there any kind of science to finding the correct angle? I mean, I took an 8 degree and pretty much nailed it. It works for me, but it's pretty much try and guess, or?
Yeah, I don't have a science or system for finding the right angle on that. I do think this falls into the realm of personal preference and a little bit of experimentation. So sorry, I don't have a magic answer on that one. Yes.
According to the charts, the V4 and the K2 V2 are similar.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between them?
Yeah, so the difference there is going to be in the diameter. So the K2 V2 compared to the Ultra V4, K2 is much less expensive. And that is because by having a slightly larger diameter, even just a tiny bit, you get a ton of stiffness just because of that diameter. And that is why thin stabilizers are very expensive if they're stiff enough to use, because the only way to keep it stiff is to use very pricey materials, really high-end carbon, and that just costs a lot to make. So if you don't need the absolute thinnest stabilizer on the market, you can save a ton of money by just going a little bit bigger on diameter, and it's still going to feel good and look good and all that. Any other ones right here?
What is vibrocore?
So vibrocore is mostly rubber powder. All of our internal damping, whether it's the tungsten or the vibrocore, it's all done through powdered materials because we find those are a really effective way to fill and use the inside of the stabilizer to remove vibration. Because of our philosophy of trying to keep as much of the cross-section minimized as possible, using the inside of the bar is really important to do that. We don't want to just put things on the outside because then they can kind of look ugly or it's out there in the wind and can be blown around. So we're trying to maximize the inside. Any other stabilizer questions? Yes?
You also have the clamps that goes on the outside of the bar.
Mm-hmm.
What is the benefit of using those?
So we don't have one that we're selling anymore, but a couple companies do make one. The purpose of that is to, two things. Number one, it can let you make really, really tiny changes in where the balance point is. Sometimes you might find, like, especially for compound shooters or somebody who's really, really in tune with their aiming, they might find that adding or removing 1 ounce is just too big of an adjustment. And then you either have to use like an aluminum weight or a half-ounce weight to make an adjustment, or you can do even more fine-tune adjustment by changing that balance point along the stabilizer. The other thing that can happen is there's 2 nodes on a stabilizer when you shoot, so there's 2 points that kind of aren't really moving as the stabilizer flexes, and you can change where those nodes are a little bit by moving a external weight or damper along the stabilizer. But that is not something that I have like great descriptions or science around yet. It's complicated. Anybody else? Yes?
You want to make a 5-degree adjustment angle.
A 5-degree for the front rod to go down? I think we're looking at making some more angles. We have the 8 and the 10 right now, and it seems like we've had some requests for a 5 lately, so we can add some more options. Anybody else? Anything else I can help with?
What do you think about recurves having a drop angle?
I've seen a couple of people do it that are good shooters, but most of the time that I've seen a good recurve shooter try the down angle, they shoot it for like a tournament or 2 and then they stop. So I think they're finding something. For some reason, it's not really working for them long term, and they're finding that just sticking with a straight stabilizer is better for them. Very, very rarely do we see the recurve shooters with the down angle. Any more questions? Are we good? Okay. Well, I hope that this was a little bit useful for you all, and I appreciate you all coming and listening to me talk about stabilizers. If you have more questions that you were too shy to ask or you forgot, I'll be all the way on the other side of the range, and you can come talk to me later. Okay.